He was the youngest man ever elected president. He brought glamour to the White House and promised a new frontier. But behind the smiles and the speeches, John F. Kennedy presided over the most dangerous moment in human history. Before we declassify the files on the Kennedy years, do your patriotic duty. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Join our cabinet of historians to make sure you never miss a briefing. Now, let's open the archives. On January 20th, 1961, the world was trapped in a precarious stasis. The Cold War had frozen Europe into armed camps and threatened to set the developing world ablaze. The Eisenhower era was characterized by grandfatherly caution and a defense strategy known as the New Look. It prioritized economic efficiency, more bang for the buck, and relied on the terrifying absolute of massive retaliation.
We must deter aggression with the threat of overwhelming nuclear response.
By 1961, Kennedy and advisors like Robert McNamara viewed this as dangerously obsolete. Threatening to incinerate Moscow over a communist incursion in Laos wasn't credible. It left the president with only two horrific choices: humiliation or suicide. Kennedy had campaigned on the myth of a missile gap favoring the Soviets. Upon taking office, classified intelligence revealed the opposite. The US held a significant advantage. However, political necessity required him to maintain a robust defense posture anyway. The new doctrine, flexible response, was a philosophical shift. It required the ability to respond across the entire spectrum of warfare, from covert operations and conventional ground wars to limited nuclear exchanges. This shift was personal. Influenced by General Maxwell Taylor's book, The Uncertain Trumpet, Kennedy championed the Green Berets. He viewed them as scholars of warfare, soldiers who could teach and heal in the jungles of the Third World to counter wars of national liberation. Simultaneously, Kennedy expanded the non-nuclear forces to raise the nuclear threshold in Europe. He also solidified the nuclear triad to ensure a second strike capability. A new strategy is just words until it's tested. And for Kennedy, that test wouldn't come in Russia, but in America's own backyard. Latin America was destabilizing. Poverty was fueling radicalism, and the 1959 Cuban Revolution provided a Soviet beachhead. In April 1961, Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, a legacy plan from Eisenhower using 1,400 CIA-trained exiles. The plan relied on the crucial assumption that the landing would spark a spontaneous uprising. The uprising never happened. Desperate to conceal U.S. involvement, plausible deniability, Kennedy stripped the operation of critical air support. The result was total failure. The force was destroyed, and the U.S. looked like a paper tiger, aggressive yet incompetent. Humiliated, Kennedy felt betrayed by the Joint Chiefs and the CIA. This distrust led him to rely on an informal circle of advisors, the XCOM, for future crises.
I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
To counter the stick of invasion, Kennedy offered the carrot of the Alliance for Progress, a Marshall Plan for Latin America, pledging $20 billion for land reform and democracy.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Ideally, it aimed to prove liberal capitalism was superior to communism. In reality, funds were siphoned by corrupt oligarchies, and the U.S. supported military dictatorships to maintain stability. By the end of the decade, the alliance was largely a failure. A more enduring success was the Peace Corps, led by Sergeant Shriver. It harnessed the idealism of the baby boom generation. While critics mocked it as Kennedy's kiddie corps, it became a potent tool of soft power. While the jungles of Latin America simmered, the Cold War's frozen heart remained in Europe, and the Soviet premier was about to see if the young president could be broken. In June 1961, Kennedy met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. It was intended as a getting-to-know-you session, but devolved into an ideological brawl. Khrushchev, sensing Kennedy's insecurity after the Bay of Pigs, bullied him. He threatened to strangle West Berlin.
I will sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany and cut off access to West Berlin. If you want war, let it be so.
Kennedy believed Khrushchev viewed him as gutless. This drove him to adopt a tougher stance to prevent further aggression.
He savaged me. It was the worst thing in my life.
The crisis in Berlin was driven by demographics. Thousands of skilled professionals were fleeing the East, threatening the economic viability of the communist state. The Soviets responded by building the Berlin Wall. Kennedy sent Vice President LBJ and 1,500 troops to show resolve, but he was privately relieved. The wall stabilized the situation by solving the refugee problem without a war.
It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war.
In 1963, Kennedy returned to deliver an iconic speech. Despite the urban legend that he called himself a jelly donut, linguists confirm his grammar was correct.
As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Kennedy had accepted the wall to avoid a war. But just 1 year later, the peace he bought in Berlin would be tested by the most dangerous 13 days in human history. On October 16, 1962, U-2 photographs confirmed the Soviets were building missile sites in Cuba capable of striking DC in minutes. This fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Kennedy convened the XCOM. Opinions diverged casually. The Joint Chiefs, led by General Curtis LeMay, argued for immediate airstrikes and invasion.
A weapon is a weapon. A blockade is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich.
Kennedy was haunted by the guns of August, how Europe stumbled into World War I through miscalculation. He chose a quarantine instead of a blockade, as a blockade was technically an act of war. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink. U.S. forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert short of war. On Black Saturday, Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba. The standing order was to retaliate. The military awaited the command. Kennedy pulled back. He realized the shot might have been a local error, not a direct order from Khrushchev, and gave diplomacy one last chance. The crisis ended with a complex deal. Publicly, the Soviets withdrew in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. Privately, Kennedy agreed to remove obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy insisted the Turkey deal remain secret to preserve NATO cohesion. While the Camelot School portrayed this as a victory of American resolve, modern historians view it as a victory of pragmatic compromise.
The greatest defeat in our history.
Kennedy had managed the acute terror of the missile crisis brilliantly, but he was less prepared for the slow-motion tragedy unfolding in Southeast Asia. If the missile crisis was Kennedy's moment of competence, Vietnam was the slow-motion tragedy. The commitment was driven by the domino theory, the belief that if South Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. When Kennedy took office, there were fewer than 1,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. By the time of his death, that number had surged to over 16,000. This escalation was driven by the 1961 Taylor-Rostow mission, which recommended massive support to save the crumbling regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam became the testing ground for flexible response. Kennedy authorized helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and U.S. advisors in combat roles. He also authorized napalm and defoliants like Agent Orange to strip the jungle cover from the Viet Cong. By 1963, the U.S.-backed President Diem launched a repressive crackdown on the Buddhist majority. The world was horrified when monk Thich Quang Duc burned himself to death in protest.
No news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world as that one.
Concluding the war couldn't be won with Diem, the Kennedy administration signaled South Vietnamese generals that the U.S. would not oppose a coup. On November 1, 1963, Diem was overthrown and assassinated. Kennedy was reportedly shaken by the murder, having expected exile, but his fingerprints were all over the coup. A fierce debate remains. Would JFK have quit Vietnam? Revisionists cite NSAM 263, his order to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of 1963, as proof of his intent to exit. However, skeptics argue this withdrawal was conditional on military success, a political bluff to show progress. When the situation worsened, the U.S. commitment was reaffirmed in NSAM 273, a document signed by LBJ, but largely drafted before Kennedy's death. While the Jungle War bogged down, Kennedy looked for a victory in a theater where no army had ever marched, the new frontier of space. Space was a primary theater of the Cold War. The Soviet launches of Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin created a global perception of Soviet technological superiority. In September 1962, Kennedy redefined the mission. He condensed 50,000 years of history to argue that the U.S. must lead the new ocean of space to ensure it remained a sea of peace. This rhetoric brilliantly reframed the race from a panicked catch-up effort into a test of the American pioneer spirit.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But the story has a twist. By late 1963, after the Missile Crisis, Kennedy was seeking détente. He went to the UN and proposed a joint US-Soviet moon mission.
Why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries cannot work together.
Khrushchev was initially suspicious, but was reportedly warming to the idea before Dallas. Had JFK lived, the space race might have evolved into a space alliance, sharing the immense financial burden of Apollo. Space offered a glimpse of cooperation, but after staring into the nuclear abyss in Cuba, Kennedy wanted more than just a race. He wanted a safeguard against the end of the world. The trauma of the Cuban Missile Crisis fundamentally altered Kennedy. Having stared into the abyss, he devoted his final year to constructing safeguards against nuclear war. In his Strategy of Peace speech at American University, he rejected a Pax Americana enforced by weapons. Instead, he humanized the Soviet enemy, something no president had done before.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal.
This new mindset produced the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 1963, banning tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and space. It addressed the environmental terror of radioactive fallout, such as strontium-90 finding its way into children's teeth. It faced fierce opposition. Senator Barry Goldwater called Soviet honesty a fatal defect, and the Joint Chiefs feared cheating. To get the treaty ratified, Kennedy had to compromise, promising the military robust funding for underground testing. To prevent the communication delays that plagued the missile crisis, the hotline was established. It wasn't a red phone, it was a teletype machine. Leaders sent written text to ensure precise translation. The first test message sent by the US was, "The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog's back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Policy was Kennedy's sword, but his personality was his shield. Let's look at the man behind the myth. Kennedy used wit to disarm critics. When accused of buying the election, he read a fake telegram from his wealthy father.
Don't buy a single vote more than is necessary. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide.
In a moment of biological détente, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a puppy named Pushinka, the daughter of the space dog Strelka. The Secret Service X-rayed her for listening devices. Finding none, she moved in, and Kennedy jokingly called her puppies with his terrier Pupniks. Kennedy's legacy is a complex duality. He built the architecture of peace that would eventually end the Cold War. Yet the same flexible response that offered alternatives to nuclear war provided the tools for the creeping intervention in Vietnam. In a speech he was prepared to deliver in Dallas on the day he died, Kennedy described the burden of American power. He realized that holding the line between peace and war was the ultimate duty.
We in this country, in this generation, are, by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom.
JFK served for only 1,000 days, but they were the days that determined the fate of the century. Now, I want to hear from you. The big question: if Kennedy had lived, do you think he would have pulled out of Vietnam? Or was he trapped by his own Cold War rhetoric? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most critical moments. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious.